You're listening to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast series by the Association for Fire Ecology.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Bob Keane. I'm the editor-in-chief of the internationally renowned journal Fire Ecology. Today, we're going to talk about a very important paper. The paper's title is Overstory and Fuel Traits, Dry Moisture Dynamics of Mesophytic and Pyrophytic Leaf Litter, 10-hour woody debris fuels in a mixed longleaf pine-hardwood woodland. And today we have two noted people to come and talk about this paper. We've got Heather Alexander and Jeffrey Cannon. Heather, would you like to introduce yourself?
Good morning, Bob. Thanks for having us here. Yes, my name is Heather Alexander. I'm an associate professor of forest and fire ecology in the College of Forestry, Wildlife, and Environment at Auburn University.
And Jeffrey, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, Bob. Thanks for having us. I'm Jeff Cannon. I'm a landscape ecologist at the Jones Center at Itchaway. We're a nonprofit research center in Southwest Georgia, and we do a lot of work around longleaf pine conservation, management, and education.
Wonderful. And Heather, you are not the senior author. Could you tell us about the senior author of this paper?
Yes, Luisa Lazaro, she was a master's student that was co-advised by Jeff and I. She is currently a PhD student in ecology at Penn State University.
Well, thank you both for being here today. I really appreciate your time and the effort you took to make this paper possible. Heather, why don't you tell us all about the paper? What's the major findings and what's the paper about?
Sure. So across the southeastern U.S., we have some really amazing fire-dependent oak, pine, and mixed oak pine forest and woodlands. And many of those have experienced decades of intentional fire exclusion. And so we've been working really hard trying to get fire back into those systems as a restoration tool. And then once we get it in there as a maintenance tool to maintain a particular structure and composition. But one of the things we're really struggling with is that during that period of fire exclusion, many of these forests have been occupied by fire-sensitive and very shade-tolerant species that, despite our efforts to remove them, they still persist across the landscape. And one of the things we're interested in is whether or not they are altering the environment in a way that influences our ability to put fire back on the landscape. And so these trees, once they get to a particular size, they could alter fire behavior through a variety of different mechanisms. One is through their fuels, the type of fuel that they're putting into the fuel bed, both through their leaf litter and also their fine woody debris. But also they may have characteristics of their crown that influence understory microclimate in a way that influences things like light availability and relative humidity. And that change in microclimate might also influence fire. And so we were actually really interested in both these things, but particularly how those two things might interact to influence fuels. And then later on, we did another study to look at fire behavior, and that's coming up in the future. But here we were focused on how these trees might influence fuels in a way that could influence fire behavior.
Wow, that's a really important subject. Jeffrey, can you tell us all about the methods you use?
Sure. Like Heather said, we were really interested in the impact of individual trees on creating these micro-engineered environments, understanding how individual trees change the temperature and moisture and all these conditions that are really important for fire behavior. So in order to do that, we first developed this innovation that was really made possible, really fine-scale measurements of fire behavior and environmental conditions. So we developed some sensors that could allow us to take lots and lots of measurements at high frequencies needed for this experiment. And commercial sensors can be really expensive. And so in the past, we developed some open source sensors that we could set these up in a really high density that we needed. And so once that was done, we took really fine scale measurements of temperature and humidity and looked at vapor pressure deficit so we could see the changing conditions underneath individual tree species. And then we set out litter bags of several different species that are expected to change fire behavior. Once we did all that, we measured how different species dried down and looked at the pattern of that. And we also looked at how the individual overstory trees modified that drying process. And so a lot of this was made possible because about 2 years ago, we set up a forest geo plot, which was part of the Smithsonian network. So we set up this large scale 40 hectare plot where all all trees larger than 1 centimeter were mapped. And so we had this living laboratory where we knew the size and locations of lots of different mixtures of pine and oak species. And so we had this nice infrastructure that we could go in and set up this experiment where we can look at individual environmental conditions that were created by overstory trees and then deploy different litter, combinations of litter, and look at the timing of dry down within them.
Great collaboration with that other project. I thought that was a wonderful use of data for your methods and your purpose. So Heather, I hate to give away the baby with the bathwater, but can you give a taste of what the results were and how useful are these results to management?
Sure. So we found some really cool things. One, we found that the pyrophytic pines and the pyrophytic oak litter, as expected, dried about, 1.5 times faster than that of mesophytic oaks, which is probably being driven by leaf litter traits that facilitate that drying process. We found that woody fuels is kind of interesting. Like a lot of people have looked at leaf litter, but very few people, I don't think anybody actually has looked at drying down rates of fine woody fuels. But we also found that, mesophytic oak woody fuels tended to have higher bulk density. And so they absorbed less moisture, but they actually dried slower than some of our pyrophytic species. And really interestingly, canopy or crown does matter. If those fuels were sitting underneath a pyrophytic pine, they dried much faster than if they were sitting beneath a mesophytic oak. And they dried especially fast if they were sitting out in the open. I think what this is saying is that these trees that encroached into the landscape during the period when fire was intentionally being excluded do have legacy effects on these ecosystems, and they do influence the way that fuels end up in the fuel bed, how fast those fuels dry, and that could have implications for the heterogeneity of prescribed fires when we place them on the landscape. That could influence whether or not fires go out when they hit these islands of more mesophytic tree species. And so the question then becomes, are there ways that we should be managing our forests using maybe some sort of silvicultural approaches to minimize the effects of these encroaching trees on the landscape? Or are there consequences of doing that as well, which is a question that Jeff and I have become more interested in too, because sometimes when you cut down a mesophytic oak, you just end up with a lot of resprouts of little guys, and that could have implications as well. And so the trees are making the environment different in a way that has the potential to influence fire behavior through their fuels.
Yeah, when I read your paper, the first thing that came to my mind was how important it is that we don't lose those pyrophytic plants, because once it goes to the mesophytic, boy, it's really hard to get back. Jeffrey, what are the next steps for your study?
Like Heather said, the smaller saplings are interesting to us as well. So Louisa's study really focused on mature individuals. So we looked at the effect that, a single large mesophytic oak or a pyrophytic oak could have on its microenvironment and fire behavior. But whenever managers are trying to do restoration projects and removing, making choices about removing individual trees, oftentimes these are sprouting species that can sprout up and form relatively dense patches of resprouts. And even if they're not resprouting after cutting, just establishment over time can create really persistent patches of sprouts that even lots of small individuals can generate pretty significant changes to fuel and fire behavior, we think. So our next steps are to harness this large-scale plot, this forest geoplot, where we have maps of individual patches of different types of oaks. And so we want to look at the effect of different densities and sizes of patches and asking, could it be these species are promoting themselves and that patches are actually growing? Or is fire slowly eroding these patches? That will help managers understand how best to do restoration projects and also understand how effective are different prescribed fire regimes.
Thank you both. This was an incredible paper, and I want to thank you for your time in talking about the paper to us and our readers of the journal. Heather, would you like to recognize any people or funding agencies?
Yes, thank you so much. I would like to recognize the members of the Forest and Fire Ecology Lab here at Auburn who were instrumental in helping Louisa prepare for field work and to write up this manuscript. I would also like to thank my NIFA Hatch and McIntyre Sinus funding for helping to support Louisa during her master's thesis.
And Jeffrey, anything else to add?
Yeah, participation from my end was funded by the Jones Center at HOA. And so I also want to thank a lot of the technicians and research associates from my lab who contributed to all the field work, and also the Jones Center conservation staff who were really accommodating and helping us implement this fire in ways that were suitable for the experiment. So thanks a lot to all of them.
Wonderful. If you listeners are wondering how you can get this paper, it's available for free at the Fire Ecology website. You don't have to spend a dime, and you get to learn all about pyrophytic and mesophytic plants. Thank you again, Heather and Jeffrey, for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
And thank you, everyone, for listening, and we'll see you on the next Fire Ecology Chats. Thank you.